Well, good morning and welcome. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see a lot of friends and familiar faces in the crowd, and as you can hear from the sirens outside, there are evidently traffic congestions. I've gotten a few emails from friends that are making their way over here. So don't be surprised if the room continues to fill as we get started. I first want to thank all of you and our panelists. It's really a terrific group, as you know, assembled behind me here. Many long-standing mentors and friends, starting with our moderator, who happens to be on the Governing Council of the Miller Center, but somebody I met almost 10 years ago, Alan Murray, who's a dear friend and terrific to anchor this wonderful panel. Also, really great for me to have Bob Rubin here, who when I was almost 20 years ago, in my early days in government working on G7 issues, was the leader of the PAC in the Clinton administration and somebody that has been a mentor to so many of us. And new friends with us, Vivian, Chris and I actually go way back as well. Chris's brother went to the University of Virginia, and finally Sid Milkus. Kathleen Hall Jamieson is going to be doing an introduction of all of them, but we wanted to give you first an overview of the first year project, so we're going to show you a quick video, and then I'll introduce Kathleen and she'll introduce our panelists.
An extraordinary democratic moment occurs with the peaceful transfer of executive power in America. Thomas Jefferson, in his first inaugural address, referred to the presidency as a post above his talents. Jefferson humbled himself before the magnitude of the undertaking. It takes 1 year for a new president to go from here to here.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
History teaches us a president's first year in office is crucial, a time of dangerous peril and exceptional opportunity.
In South Mogadishu, the problem for UN forces has been controlling the street.
The president was hit. He was wounded. God.
I can hear you.
The real world tests the untested commander-in-chief, and the new president must act. It is also when presidents can enact their enduring policies.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Whether renewing America's promise at home or making historic breakthroughs on the world stage. As Inauguration Day 2017 approaches, our responsibility is to look beyond, to prepare for the new president's pivotal first year in office. How will our 45th president staff a cabinet, prioritize an agenda, and act on it? What risks and rewards dwell on the horizon? The Miller Center has launched a nonpartisan effort to research those pressing challenges and to take those ideas directly to the presidential candidates and their staffs, to opinion leaders, and to the public at large. The First Year Project illuminates the major issue areas, featuring public events, digital components, and vigorous promotion and communication strategies. We are connecting history with policy and impact.
President Truman on the line, sir.
Hello? How you feeling? I'm feeling pretty good. How are you? Oh, I'm having hell. What's the trouble? Well, I got a little bit in the Congress and a little bit with the Indochina, the Vietnamese, and a little bit all over the country, and I just thought I'd call you and try to get a little advice and a little inspiration.
The Miller Center specializes in studying the institution of the presidency. We apply the lessons of history to contemporary public policy challenges, helping to understand and shape the modern presidency. Our scholars have conducted comprehensive oral histories for every administration since President Carter, creating a living network of the most senior officials who have led our executive branch. The Miller Center brings the lessons of history to life and connects the past to the future.
So that lays out the project for you. What we've done for the last 9 months has been releasing essays in a number of discrete areas for helping the incoming administration and their transition team think through a first year. And the set of essays that we've just released and we're going to be talking about today are navigating the broken political system. And this essay in particular is a real exciting one for us, which has been authored by a team of experts from McKinsey on the lessons of CEO transitions and what applies and what doesn't apply to managing the biggest corporate entity in the world, the U.S. government. And this memo's origins go back to a Fortune CEO conference last November in San Francisco, where the head of McKinsey globally, Dom Barton, and I sat down and talked about it, and Dom got very excited about it, and Vivian and her team have done a terrific job of working through their experience over hundreds of CEO transitions that they've managed. We're really delighted to be doing this today in partnership with Fortune and with the Annenberg Retreat at Sunnylands. And I want to hand over the microphone to do the introductions to Kathleen Hall Jamieson, who is the Elizabeth Ware Packard Professor of Communications at the Annenberg School and also works with the Annenberg Retreat. So, Kathleen,
thank you. And I'm going to defy those orders and not introduce the panel because these people are so distinguished. You know their faces, you know their names, you know who they are, and their descriptions here. And Alan is going to perform that capable function. Instead, I'm going to take 1 minute to explain why it is that we are interested as the Annenberg Retreat in Sunnylands in the first year. And that is, we hope that in the first year, in addition to doing everything the Miller Center and this distinguished panel recommends, the President of the United States, whoever she or he may be, will come to Sunnylands and do as President Obama did with Xi and with the ASEAN Summit and use the Camp David of the West to advance world peace and understanding. The Sunnylands Trust was set up by Walter and Lee Annenberg. Philadelphians know them. Walter made his fortune here with TV Guide, with 17 Magazine, with the Philadelphia Inquirer, a chain of newspapers, and with the television stations that ultimately became the ABC network. He deeded his estate, as did Lee Annenberg, his wife, to essentially public trust, with the hope that it would be used as a site to build cooperation across branches of government to promote the public good and be used by the President of the United States as the Camp David of the West. We hope that you will remember, and you'll pick up Sunnylands materials, when you see someone who's a prospective President of the United States, that Sunnylands is there for the use of him or her in that first critical year. It's my pleasure to introduce our retreat director, Becky Avila. If you have any questions about the retreat, she will answer them. Jeff Baum, whom you've seen in the back of the room, is our communication director. Please take one of our bags, and in particular, show the bag any place you see someone who might influence the President of the United States, who might decide to come to Sunnylands. With that, let me introduce Alan Murray, a distinguished, award-winning journalist and editor.
Thank you.
Good job.
Don't need to. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Bill. Kathleen, I hope you're prepared under certain circumstances to do a name change at Sunnylands, which may be necessary in order to make your dream fulfilled. Look, this is, I hope you all know this, this is the most important event taking place this week in Philadelphia. So you are the lucky ones who made your way through the police barricades and actually got here for this. It's a very interesting conversation because, as Bill has been saying for the last several years, and as this video shows, what happens in the very early days of an administration sets the tone for the rest of it in so many, many ways. And we have a great panel here to talk about this that comes at it from different perspectives. Chris Lu was in the White House the first 4 years, as cabinet secretary the first 4 years of the Obama administration, then moved on to the Department of Labor to get a little R&R. Vivian Reifberg, as Bill said, has been at McKinsey overseeing the study of this question: how do CEO transitions and presidential transitions compare to each other? And her practice deals on both sides of that great divide and can help us sort of elucidate the similarities and the differences. Bob Rubin has done it all, and I urge you to keep your chance. We want Bob down here today. We will get to him soon enough, and he will have his opportunity to talk, but has overseen White House transitions and has also seen transitions in the private sector, so has a great perspective on this. And Sid Milkis is one of the most respected academics on the presidency and can bring a more rigorous academic approach to the discussion. Prepare for rigor, Sid. We're expecting it from you. And there are a number of people in the audience here who I know have also have their own perspectives. So we're going to leave plenty of time for to make this a discussion. But what I'd like to do to kick it off is to ask each of the four of you to, if you had to distill your knowledge and your experiences into one single piece of advice or bit of wisdom for the next president in considering how to attack this critical transition period, what would it be and why? And Chris, since yours is freshest, I'm going to make you go first.
Thank you. I'll sort of do it in a two-part. I would say start early and expect the unexpected. We started planning the 08 transition in April of 2008 when then Senator Obama and I had a conversation about the importance of planning. And it comes back to a movie that we both loved, which is The Candidate. And if people have seen that wonderful 1972 movie with Robert Redford, it ends with him off stage having just won the Senate seat in California, and he says to one of his aides, "Now what do I do?" And we never wanted to be standing there on election night in Grand Park not knowing what to do. So we started planning April of 2008, 2 months before we had even wrapped up the nomination. And I'd say expect the unexpected. We started planning in the spring of 08 with an equal priority on education, immigration, healthcare, all these different issue areas. And then obviously by the time you get to the fall of 08, you have a financial crisis, you have a housing crisis, you have an economic meltdown, which forces you to retool all of your planning. And then obviously as you go through the transition period, there are personnel decisions that don't work out for one reason or another that forces you to retool again. So as well as you plan, something or many things will happen that you do not expect.
Yeah. Viv.
So there are 2 million civilian federal workers. There are 4,000 political appointees, give or take, and about 400 who are Senate confirmed. And I think my advice is that you need to build a team that is going to both support and challenge you. You have those 4,000 people, and you better recognize that they are not the only people you have to touch. You have to touch the permanent bureaucracy, the people who are going to be there and who will either decide early on that they can wait you out or that they can get on board. And so my advice is find excellent people who can both support and challenge you, and recognize that you are both setting direction and policy, but you also have to make sure the place operates and is managed well. And so finding people who are excellent and a balance of those people in both policy and in making sure things are well run and know how to operate. And to recognize that that's your lever, because this job is not like being the CEO of a company. It's vastly bigger, and it's vastly more complicated. And so the leverage of the people is going to be critical.
But Viv, that advice to find the right team that both supports you and challenges you, is that fundamentally any different than what you would say to a CEO?
That piece is not fundamentally different. But I think what is fundamentally different is the breadth of what you cover.
Yeah.
The world. You're the President of the United States. The world is watching you. So the breadth is different. In terms of the geographic and the range of issues, the relentlessness of you guys.
Let's not generalize.
24 by 7.
We're trying to avoid typecasting here this
24 by 7, 365, and in a social media world, it's not just the organized media, it's everybody. And then finally, quite frankly, you can't manage by authority. You have a set number of people. You have Congress. You have, the career, and you are just one branch of a three-branch government. So that is quite
That's very different. Very different, yeah. Bob.
Yeah, much of what I was going to say you just said, so I'll expand on that a touch, because I agree with it. I think in terms of the people, Alan, I think you've got to make a decision. What kind of a culture do you want to have? Some people want to have a team of rivals. Some people, like President Clinton, want to have collegiality. And when President Clinton talked to me about coming to the White House to start the NEC, we spent 2 hours together. He never talked about economic policy. I couldn't figure out what the devil he was spending his time doing. And then I realized what he was doing. He was trying to get a sense of me as an individual and how I would fit into the kind of culture that he wanted to have. So I think decide what kind of a culture, and either kind can work. I personally think the teamwork one is much better. Secondly, as you said, you're going to have people around you, and then you're going to have people at further distance. You've got to encourage people to tell you the truth. And being president's a big deal job, and a lot of people get intimidated by it. And President Clinton said to us during the transition, before we got to the White House, he said, I'm going to be president of the United States, which is a big deal. But he said, if you all don't tell me what's really on your mind, especially when you disagree with me, I'll be dead. And so you've got to set that sort of framework. I think it's important, Alan, to have a sense of what your priority is going to be going in. And surely there'll be a lot of surprises, and that will change. But at least try to have a sense before you get there what it's going to be, and set up a process that will keep you focused on that. Because once you're there, the immediate is going to be crowding out the strategic all of the time.
One priority?
No, I think you're not going to have one priority in a complex world, but what your priorities are. And I'll add one more that I think is especially relevant at this moment in our country's history. We're all focused on the presidential election, and it's obviously massively important. But whoever the president's going to be can accomplish, in my opinion at least, relatively little by executive action. There are things you can do, and they're important, and they should be done. But fundamentally, if we're going to meet the great challenges of our era, they're going to have to be done predominantly through Congress. And so what I would do is I would be thinking right now, well, not this moment, first you want to get yourself on the way to getting elected, but once you're elected, I would reach out to Congress and try to develop both a strategy and personal relationships and positions, to the extent possible, that you can talk about with the members of particularly the opposing party, but both parties, to maximize the probability that once you get there, you can actually function. Because I think the great challenge to our country, upon which the future of our country depends, is whether or not Congress is going to move from its virtual total dysfunctionality today to one in which it actually is legislating.
So, Bob, you said not right now, but when I listened to that 60 Minutes interview on Sunday night and heard Tim Kaine spend a fair amount of time praising Paul Ryan, which serves absolutely no political purpose in the middle of an election,
I agree with you.
Seemed to be the first time I had heard someone in this campaign saying, hey, let's think about what it's going to be like after November.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, Alan. When I said right now, I kind of think it's important to get elected, too.
Doesn't do any good to lay the groundwork if you don't get elected. But that's the tension we're talking about. I mean, you were working on this in April when you didn't know have any idea what the outcome was.
But the reaching out, the developing the relationships, in which you see if you can find some basis from which to have discussions, and also try to win some sort of personal relationship with people is I think, something you can do a great deal about before you actually take office.
Sid, did you want to say something?
I was going to say, I think what you could do now with Congress is not burn any unnecessary bridges. I think there's a lot of bridge burning going on in the world, and I think you can take a view that says, is that really necessary to get elected? Do I have
to burn that particular bridge in order to...
some people in the private sector call the Congress your ultimate board of directors. It doesn't quite hold for me, but recognizing they have a huge stake in what happens is critical.
Well, I think on that, part of the problem is going to be whoever wins. This is a presidential election which both of the candidates have negatives in excess of 50%. So somehow or other, you've got to try to give Congress, or the leaders of Congress, a sense that they have a stake in successfully legislating, and that's not going to be easy, but critical.
Sid, give us some perspective here.
Yeah, I don't know if this is rigorous, but I was saying to Vivian in the green room, it's really fun for an academic to be in a green room, by the way, that I think the next president, as recent presidents have had to consider, has to prepare to starting a war zone. I think it was Mike Tyson who said plans are great until you get hit in the face. And that's pretty much the way American politics operates. Now, recrimination didn't start with Donald Trump. He's brought it to a kind of weird climax. But we've seen plenty of this kind of personalized partisanship where the parties differ, not only on principles. We've had plenty of that in our history. But now, each party, in a way I think is a little different, challenges the other party's motivations. And particularly the presidency is the focus of this negative recrimination. So I think the next president has to figure out how to operate, how to negotiate this personalized, executive-centered, partisan rancor. And I think I would just say two things about that. One is you cannot ignore there are differences between the parties. So I don't think anybody should become president thinking they're going to transcend red and blue America. I think you have to recognize there are differences between the parties, but try to get it off the personal. You know, the attacks on Obamacare. We didn't call Social Security Roosevelt care. Try to get it off the personal. And I like what my colleagues have said about try to get things out of the White House for some institutional engagement. So if I was the next president, what I would do is do something institutionally innovative with Congress. So Woodrow Wilson, when he became president, became the first president since Thomas Jefferson, who abandoned this practice, of addressing Congress in person for major addresses. And it captured the attention of the nation, and it was kind of a foundation for real success he had with the Congress for a while. And one thing I thought about it would be interesting, I think, a risk, but I think it would be interesting if the next president has something like a prime minister's hour and has something between the State of the Union message and an impeachment as the way to engage the Congress.
Yeah. So, Chris, let's stay on that because, you know, in Barack Obama, you had a candidate who catapulted into the national imagination in 2004 by specifically saying he was going to address the problem that Bob and Sid have talked about. You know, no red America, no blue America. We're going to bring people together. And I don't know what your conversations were like from April and December, but there was a sense that that was going to be a high priority. And as an observer, I would say it did seem to be a high priority for about 8 days, and then we got into it. So how can you address that in planning for an administration?
I will say this: I never disagree with my colleagues, especially a former Treasury Secretary. But I will tell you that I'm the cynic of the group. I would have a long list of executive actions, and I'd be ready to go on day one.
Wow.
I have seen. You know, when Mitch McConnell says, you know, in 2009 that he's going to make this president a one-term president, when every Republican votes against an $800 billion stimulus package to get the economy jump-started, when, you know, we win re-election in 2012 and they still block immigration reform, they block gun control after Sandy Hook. I've lost faith in the...
That's a pretty hopeless scenario.
I have lost faith, and so and again, it's not to say that we should and that the new president should not extend an olive branch. I think the dynamics in this country lead to continued gridlock. There's a lot more going on right now that I think, you know, short of a supermajority in both the House and the Senate, it's hard for me to see how the political dynamics change.
Yeah, Bob.
Chris, I don't disagree with you. I am deeply troubled about Congress, and I'd have my whole list of executive actions. But if you take all of them and you put them together, unfortunately, the great problems of our nation are not going to be solved by
executive action.
So what I would do is I would do what you said, so I agree with you, because I also have this very troubled view of Congress. But I would spend a ton of time between the time I got elected and the time I took office seeing if there's anything I could do about that, both in terms of personal relationships and finding some sort of possible common ground pursuant to which we could move forward.
Yeah. It also depends on what the courts are going to do, what the courts are going to look like. Because the immigration, the second immigration order, which was really huge, is now, you know, tied up, if not rejected, by the courts. So when you do executive orders and you push the envelope on the rule of law, and many of these executive orders I support the policy, but then you risk bringing the courts.
You're challenging the court
in a regular, in a routine way, into the details of policy, and that's not necessarily a good form of constitutional democracy, constitutional representative government.
You know, an interesting question on picking people. I think that you said, I totally agree with you, whether it be private sector or public sector, you've got to have strong people. And the pressures to take all sorts of other considerations into account are going to be enormous. But I think a president's success in some fair measure depends on getting strong people and people who have the same cultural characteristics that he or she wants to have, and also approach decision-making in the same way. I believe all decisions are matters of probabilities, not certainties. And I think it's important that you get people who approach decision-making the same way you do. But something President Clinton did, which I think is worth remembering too, is not in the beginning, but as time went on with Erskine Bowles, he brought in putting people into key jobs who he thought were well suited to working with the other party. And so if I were the new president, whichever one it turns out to be, though I have a rather strong preference as to which it should be.
And who is that, Bob?
I question whether one wants to live here or in Canada, but anyway. But be that as it may, I try to find some people that I put into very senior positions who I thought were well equipped to work across the aisle.
Like somebody like Bob Gates, which was a really...
Well, that's a Republican. I don't necessarily think you have to go that far, but...
Well, that didn't last very long.
The new era of bipartisanship.
That was unprecedented, by the way, for a new party coming in and keeping...
But Erskine Bowles was somebody who really was very well equipped to work across the party aisle.
Viv.
Yeah, it's interesting, the question of what your priorities are. I think there's a tremendous, I think there's an over-indexing on the first 100 days that is likely to go on. And yes, I think there are things you have to get done and you should get done and you will be pressured to do. But I think it's actually quite important to say, among those priorities, are there any that this next president could pick that really do speak to this bipartisan question and really are something that there is a chance for real common ground, instead of picking only the things that are, poking the eye in the...
What does that look like? Can you get specific?
Can I give you an example? The one thing that's always been bipartisan in Washington is infrastructure spending. You know, when gas is $2.20 and we can't raise a gas tax that's been the same for the last 30 years, even though you drive down I-95, you see the problems, you go to the airports, you see, I took Amtrak up here. Anyone who thinks that's high-speed rail is kidding themselves. I mean, we have a failing infrastructure system, and we can't find bipartisan consensus to fund it.
Well, there was, in Congress, there was a fairly large bipartisan group that was starting to affiliate around this notion of bringing back some of the so it's kind of a small piece of tax reform tied to infrastructure spending. Bring back some of the profits that are locked overseas by high tax rates, and then you put that into infrastructure bonds. Maybe gimmicky, but it was a notion that had bipartisan appeal. Is that, can you build from that? You also you listen to Paul Ryan. I assume this is what Tim Kaine was doing. You listen to Paul Ryan. He understands the problem of dispossessed workers. Is there common ground there where you can start to put together something that makes sense? You look skeptical, Bob.
No, I don't know if there is or there isn't. I think the concept of common ground may be a little bit wrong, Alan. Marty Feldstein, who all of you know is a highly respected conservative economist, said to me not long ago that there are just very large policy and political divides in our country, and that's something you do have to face. That's the reality. But he said that isn't the problem. The problem is the unwillingness to compromise across those in some principled way so that you move forward. And we did the 97 balanced budget agreements, not that President Clinton and Trent Lott agreed. Casey, by the way, took credit for that on television, on these, which just drove me batty. But anyway, leave that aside. It was Trent Lott and President Clinton. And I was in the Oval Office when they made their final decision. It wasn't because they found you can call it common ground if you want to, but rather each one was willing to give up some things they cared about to get other things.
Okay, so Bob Dole...
willingness to compromise.
Bob Dole, after he lost for the last time, said, if I had been elected president, I would bring the leaders of Congress down to the White House, and I'd say, we're coming here every day until we figure out how to do this, how to work together. I mean, is that possible? You sound very skeptical. Viv, I'm sorry.
Well, I think there's if you look at corporate life and you look at political life, and I've been in Washington 27 years.
God help you.
And one of the things that has really changed in that period of time is the personal relationship. In corporate life, you live with, but you work with these people day in and day out. You debate issues, you have challenges, you have crises, but you work together. You know these people. Your board, you know them if you're the CEO. You've worked with them, you know what makes them tick, you know what ticks them off. One of the things that's changed in Washington in 27 years is the personal relationships in town. Do you know your committee colleagues and their staffs and their friendships and their children's issues and what's going on in their lives? We do not have that same human kind of connection.
But as President of the United States, what can you do about that?
I think as President of the United States, you can encourage your leadership team to take more of an orientation to get to know people critical to that. When you go to if you're running an agency and you're going to work with a set of oversight committees in Congress, are you waiting to avoid them, or are you actually
President Obama at one White House Correspondents' Dinner, when he had been chided, said, you should go have drinks with Mitch McConnell. Finally, he said it in jest, but I think he meant it. He said to the White House correspondents, "You go have drinks with Mitch McConnell." I don't want to have drinks with Mitch McConnell.
Can I just say? Can I just say? I'm proud to say I'm from Philly. I've not spent my time in D.C. So I think the personal relationships are important, and I think, but George W. Bush was apparently great at personal relationships.
Back in
Everybody
Texas.
speaks about him, says that no matter what. And President Obama is not as enthusiastic about schmoozing, as we say in Philly. So I don't. That's not to deny your point, but I think we have a problem with the decline of institutions in American politics. As we've seen this presidential campaign season, there's been a great decline in the party's ability to act as a filter in the presidential campaigns. And there also is a problem with the presidential leadership in Congress and the ability to really mobilize your members in support of something. I think you guys would know better than I, but I think John Boehner and President Obama were close to a really serious budget deal where there would be both some reasonable tax increases and entitlement reform. But it was the backbenchers, the caucuses, in the Republican Party that undermined.
Yeah, so it's
not.
Can I just go ahead, please, Chris.
I do think, and since the point's an important one, bringing the congressional leadership together would make a difference if the congressional leadership could bind their own members. And as you saw, whether it was in the grand bargain in 2011, whether it's Paul Ryan's challenges of corralling his 30 or 40 members who are going to vote against anything, or Mitch McConnell's, in an institution that runs by unanimous consent, any one person can block anything in the U.S. Senate. And all the incentives right now are for that one senator gets more press attention by blocking Mitch McConnell than he does by going along with it.
But if you believe, as this panel, some on this panel at least have said, that this is the single biggest problem we face, then, and you're President of the United States, you're going to become President of the United States, and you recognize that, what the hell do you do? I mean, you can't rebuild institutions in 100 days.
No, one thing you can do, and I never thought of it until we were just sitting up here. I do think you need I agree with you. You need very strong people and people of the qualities, cultural and other characteristics that you want to be successful in the various posts. But I think I would put a heavy emphasis on getting the kind of people who I think can work across the aisle. And I would try to fashion a cabinet and a White House staff that was well equipped, well suited by virtue of their characteristics to try to make this work, even if the probabilities, Chris, I agree with you, are low. I'll tell you another thing I would do, Alan. I think a lot of administrations have had, in fact, most administrations have had tremendous problems functioning internally. Mm-hmm. And what President Clinton decided to do in 1992 was to set up this thing called the NEC, the National Economic Council, to try to coordinate activities so that all the people, all the cabinet members who had an equity in or an interest in a subject would be around the same table. So he could get a fully informed view. And I think it's very important to focus on your processes and then figure out how to make them work.
But can I just push back on that for a little bit? Because the way I remember that first year...
Well, you covered it, but not properly.
Yeah. I was going to say...
Now the knives come out.
The way I remember that first year...
if you remember it the way you wrote it, God help it.
All right. So leave me out of it. I mean, Bob Woodward wrote a book.
Yeah, well, that book, let me tell you, that book was worse than your coverage. But anyway.
But there was a pretty tough controversy where you had a group of populists who wanted a kind of a very progressive agenda, and you had, I mean, that was, and you had your group that was pushing for something a little more economic focus. It was. I'm trying to understand when you say that wasn't a team of rivals, that was a collegial little working group. What you mean?
But look, see, this is the problem with the coverage. But look what happened. We would meet in the Roosevelt Room, and Don, you weren't there then yet, I don't think. But we all sat around. No, because then when you came, that created fracas too. But
did he cause the rivalries?
We all sat around the table, and people exchanged views, and we had some very different views. But then we went to the President of the United States, not individually sneaking into the Oval Office, but we went to the President with an options memo which said, some of us think this, some of us think that. I was head of the NEC, it so happens, and I felt a tremendous responsibility to following two precepts. One, that all the cabinet members felt they were being treated fairly and their views were being treated fairly. And secondly, that he saw everybody's views without anybody stumping on the scale. So then he would have all the views in front of him at the same time instead of people going separately around the process, and he could make a fully informed decision, which is what he did.
You know,
but it's hard to make that work.
Go ahead.
Well, it's very interesting because that's much more of a, I think, what corporate
model.
CEOs try to put in place.
Yeah.
Is to
Good
really
ones.
get
Good
ones.
corporate CEOs.
Good corporate CEOs try to put in place. The other thing, you know, and none of us are 22. So we should ask a bunch of 22-year-olds what they think.
Chris is
in a
close.
world with, in a world of communications that is so different from anything that any of us grew up with. I think this emphasis that we tell people, communicate, communicate, communicate until you are ill, and then communicate
But that's true in the C-suite as well.
And that is completely true in the C-suite today. The ability to communicate your ideas internally, externally, and relentlessly, I think is very important. And so, to me, I would find people, in addition to yourself, who can take the case not only to Congress and all the others, but directly out there to the people to make a difference. Because one thing Congress does respond to is some pressure, some of the time. And I think you can create a communications approach that gets out there along with getting the best facts and insights that the Secretary raises to the President of the United States.
So you don't think, you're not talking about the President talking all the time?
No, I am talking about all of the people who work for him, bringing the case all the way down. The cascading of communications, it's a very corporate thing today to get that all the way down to the frontline employees. Well, we've got to get it down the front line of the country.
Yeah. One of the things that I really thought was, I think has been innovative in the Obama administration is to form this organization called Organizing for Action now. And they're kind of the combination of information, grassroots mobilization, I think has been a lot more effective than people think. And the number of tweets and emails those people put out in support of the President's agenda has really helped, I think, him stave off a kind of lame duck status in his second term.
Yeah, I honestly don't know, but again, the orientation.
I've got a 70-page paper.
So one question we're dancing around a little bit here is that if you're the CEO of a big company and you communicate and people aren't getting the message, they go. You can fire them. You can't do that in government.
Well, you can't, actually it's an interesting question. Before I became secretary, I met with Lloyd Benson, who was my predecessor. We had dinner. And he had a list of all the people there, and he said he'd taken care of all the problems so that I could get a clean slate. But he said, there are a couple I didn't. Yeah, but then he said, then there are a couple I didn't, but you'll worry about those.
You didn't believe him.
I would have been skeptical. I knew Lloyd extremely well. I was skeptical, I thought the world of him.
Right.
But in any event, it became apparent that it wasn't quite true. There were some people that had special characteristics that made it very difficult to deal with. And those he left for me. But I think there's a lesson in that. And I had the same lesson at Goldman Sachs when I took over a big part of their business that had not previously been run by me. If you've got problems, deal with them quickly. Don't let them
Totally.
fester. And that's a very important lesson, I think.
Even if the replacement has to get confirmed by Congress,
if they're career people, which is where you can run into problems, Alan, maybe you can't replace somebody, but you can design around them.
Isolate them.
Well, you put other people in, you supplement, you do one thing or another.
Did you want to say something about that?
No, I think the situation we're in with getting confirmed people through is problematic.
Yeah,
because it just is problematic because in corporate life, this does not go on. And the idea that you're going to have, 5, 8 top positions not filled, and this isn't for weeks on end, this is sometimes months, and in some cases, there's been years. I think this is something that, I'd love to see someone put the challenge to both candidates today to make some kind of commitment around and to Congress.
Chris,
today.
how would you advise? I mean, that's a huge problem. If what Bill and the Miller Center are saying is that the first year defines the presidency, but you can't even get your team in place until the end of the first year. How will the next president deal with that?
I think it's a challenge. I mean, I spent an entire career never wanting to go through Senate confirmation, and I finally went through. And in an age now of social media, you should expect that every Facebook post, every tweet is now scrutinized. They asked me, I wrote a column for my school newspaper when I was in Princeton 30 years ago that they wanted a copy of every single column I had ever written. I said, look, this is pre-internet, so if you want to go and pull the bound volumes, feel free to go do it. I wasn't going to do it for them. Did
you prevail on that?
I did prevail on that. It is an incredibly intrusive process to make people go through it. The Department of Labor, since we regulate every company in the country, we have to divest every individual stock of any company. So imagine doing that in 2009 in the middle of a recession, what the financial downsides of that are. And yes, you're right. I mean, when we went back and as we plan ahead for this next transition, at the Department of Labor, which is not a department that the Republicans generally like very much, it took us 18 months or more to get our assistant secretaries confirmed. And there's no way to run a government that way.
So what's your... What if you were advising the next president? How would you say you just deal with it?
Well, I think it's look. I think that again, this is you can sit down with the Senate leadership and try to work something out. But again, Mitch McConnell can't bind the people in his caucus, and and I think you need to understand. I mean, if this is a Clinton administration, which I hope and believe it will be, I think the question is should everyone go? And that's the other question.
Bob, and then we'll open it up for questions. So.
No, I just think it's something else. I think a new president, or a new CEO for that matter, either way, ought during the transition to think through what are the principal... I said before, I think you need to think through your priorities, but I think I do another thing, Alan. The communication thing reminded me of it. I think very early in my term, either as CEO or as a president, I would give a series of speeches, or maybe it's not a series, maybe it's 2 or 3 or whatever it is, however you want to organize, in which I really set out my vision for the country. And I'd want that set out so that whatever the debates may, and I would do it in a very, in a manner that hopefully could be broadly related to, even though you have these terrific partisan and political problems in Congress. That would then become the framework for my 8 years in office. Obviously, things will change and priorities will change, one thing or another, but in a broad, systemic sense, I think I would try to set out my vision for the future of the country, at least as relates to domestic and foreign policy, maybe divide up in some other ways too.
It's really interesting to look at the way Roosevelt kind of laid the groundwork for the enactment of Social Security by making a series of speeches about how we had to think about a new social contract in light of the tremendous changes caused by the Industrial Revolution. Instead of pursuing it right away, he felt he had to
Make the case.
Well, it's your social media comment that reminded me of it, because once you do that, then you can get out and try to create acceptance of what it is that you were trying to accomplish.
Well, a great example of that is clearly in this next administration is going to be trade, because the consensus for trade agreements has collapsed, and I don't see any way you're going to get a trade agreement through Congress unless you rebuild that consensus somehow first.
Alan, because trade really should be part of a larger picture. Because what President Clinton used to say, and he was right, trade, now it's mostly technology, is driving enormous change that on the one hand is positive for growth, but on the other hand, it's creating wage and job pressure. So you have to wrap it all together in some sort of inclusive growth strategy.
Story.
That bigger story that you set out, exactly.
Yeah. We've got a lot of people in the audience who have lived through this from one perspective or another. Who would like to jump into this conversation? Right here, please.
I have a comment and then
hang on, and identify yourself before your comment, please.
Leslie Gilbert-Lurie from Los Angeles. And my question, well, my observation first, just to throw out one sentence, is when you talk about communicating, I'm struck in this world how many incredibly great communicators there are, you know, in every side of the aisle, but how few good listeners there are. And so my thought is always how many courses there are even in universities about speaking and communicating, and none on listening. So I'm wondering, first of all, how a president could begin to, infuse that value also into the administration in the course of doing business. But then my second question is, at least in this era of Citizens United and the way that any president will have gotten elected in this term, how does a president get educated or listen to people who are not huge contributors to their campaign, as long as campaign finance exists the way it is today? I'm struck by how many times I've been invited even, to dinners for presidents in Los Angeles. For $32,000, you could have an intimate dinner with the president.
Both great questions. I think the listening point is a good one, and then campaign finance.
Can I do the communications? I think the challenge is, and you know this better than anyone, the state of journalism right now. When I travel around the country, I deliberately don't pick up a copy of USA Today or New York Times. I pick up the local paper. Even in a place like Philadelphia, I defy you to find national stories about national or international stories on the front page that are not AP stories. It is hard to find good coverage of what's happening in Washington or around the world. You think about the dominance of talk radio, of social media. One of my favorite colleagues from the cabinet, Congressman Ray LaHood, who was our transportation secretary, used to say that if you were a farmer driving around your tractor in Peoria, you would turn on AM radio and you'd get a steady diet of Hannity and Limbaugh all day long. And that's the listening part, or the lack of listening part.
One thing that strikes me is it's not so much people don't listen, it's their listening is very selective.
Yes.
And the media has become so fragmented. So conservatives will listen to Fox News, and liberals will listen to CNBC, but they won't listen to each other. And something as a political scientist, I like to be rigorous about this, but I'm never sure. There's been tremendous changes in the media that are extremely important, and I think dovetail with the kind of polarization we've talked about. But I don't know if that's a cause of polarization or it just reflects what's going on anyway. But it seems to me that the present shape of the media and blogging has really created an echo chamber that makes it
front row right here. I'm happy to talk about the media at great length, or kick the question to Don Baer if.
I'm Ernest Wilson. I'm Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication at USC. One of the issues that seems to be running through this campaign, and we hear about it from left, right, and center, is the issue of trust. And so if you look at the Pew studies, you look at Edelman on the private sector side, and the level of trust across the Western democracies, including in the United States, has fallen precipitously. And so in the first 100 days, in addition to laying out the sort of policy priorities that Bob mentioned, what can the incoming president do to address this underlying lack of trust in religious organizations, political organizations, economic organizations? Love to hear your comments.
You make a very good point. Peter Hart, who does the NBC Wall Street Journal polling, has done polls on confidence of the American people in our institutions. And you've probably seen them because you raised the point. But we really should get hold of these. Peter says that if you go back X years, and I don't remember if it was 20 years or 30 years or whatever it was, but you had about a 70% confidence in most of our institutions. Today, most of our institutions is below 25%, and many of them below 20%. And I think the only institution that's above 50%, no, there were two. One's the military, and there was one other. But how does the society function when the people have lost confidence in their institutions? And I think, unfortunately, I think it's a very complicated, I think you really raised a hell of a point. This is one person's view, take it for what it's worth. Most Americans are not doing well in this environment, and that's something we need to face. There are a lot of policy responses one could have to that. I think there's a great deal we could do, but that requires government to work. But they don't have confidence in government because of the conditions, and you got a vicious cycle. And the question is, how do we break through that vicious cycle? And I think the future of our country, I said before, it depends on whether Congress is willing to.
Don't you, Bob? Don't you? If you're coming in as president, don't you almost have to take that as a given? There's, your ability as president of the United States to change that. If you take on that problem, you probably won't be able to do anything else.
But
and so go ahead.
I agree with that. I don't know how you take it on, but I guess, I said before, maybe I'm wrong, I'm not saying I'm right, Don knows multiples more than I do about this stuff, but I would set out the issue that we're just discussing as part of my large picture as to how I want to think about America and what I want to accomplish in the time that I'm here. Whether that helps set a framework which enables you to more effectively work with Congress or not, I mean, I share Chris's concern, but I think I would explicitly set that out as the vicious cycle that is undermining our society.
Don, he claims you know something about this. Do you want to... Could you take the mic? Just wait for the microphone and identify yourself for the...
I'm Don Bayer, CEO of Burson Marsteller, former colleague of Bob Rubin's, former client on the stage, Vivian Riefberg, and Alan Murray, who's mostly been a friend for 40 years. So what presidents, there's a great line from the Stephen Sondheim musical, I think, Into the Woods. Children will listen. Right? So I don't mean to make the American people sound like the children, because that really is condescending and not the point. People listen. People pay attention very closely to what presidents say.
Yes.
And to the tone with which they say it, and the consistency and the persistence with which they say it.
I agree with that.
And at the very start, and to be honest, this campaign, it doesn't start on November the 9th. It starts now. The tone, the expressed desire to bring people together across lines that divide and to mean it. And the other thing, that it's just not about listening, because showing is more important than telling in communications. All of these things matter. And so I think it's critically important for anyone who would lead to take every opportunity that she or he can take to cast the right message and tone. Now, in the heat of a heavily fought campaign like the one we're in and that we will be in, that will be extremely difficult. But I would also suggest that President Clinton used to always say, and Bob remembers this, it's amazing how often the right political thing to do is the right thing to do. And the point being that in this campaign, casting that tone, setting that tone, I believe will wind up being the right political thing to do for whomever wins this election.
Yeah, Viv.
I want to build on something Don said. One of the things that we often tell CEOs, and I think it's absolutely true for the president, you underestimate the way people are watching you. You don't realize that if you say X, because they want to believe that you have clarity about what you're doing, and if they hear something that resonates with them, they want to follow you. It's not, and they want to engage with you. So it's actually quite important what you say, how you say it, and that you show them that you're listening. You don't just tell them that you're listening. So how you bring groups of people together in corporate life, whether you spend time out side of your community that's, you know, the 12th floor of a building, whatever it is, that you really get out there. So I think this president, in a modern social media world, has to recognize that the institutions as we know them may be going away. And you may have to be far more agile, but new communities are forming. They're just not what you've seen before. And I think you have to be willing to, you know, invite in people. And I do make a little bit of an age comment, because I think our younger people do understand this. My 18-year-old son thinks about community very, very differently, and it's his community online. He has a whole music community online. It's not an organized music organization in the local community. It's kids from 10 different cities that he's interacted with. I just think we have to be far more agile and open to what is a community and how we communicate with it.
Thanks, Alan. Rob Colorina, I'm with the investment group. Could the topic of these transition teams, committees, I think there's a short-term orientation, but then some of the longer-term advisory and commissions at the White House, do they need some spark? What more are they looking for there? I mean, you know, in terms of critical thinking, you know, tough love type of input.
I will tell you those advisory, and again, I think this goes to the question, how do people inside the bubble get the views of people who haven't just contributed $32,000? I think whether it's the advisory committees that are established through the White House or through agencies or other ad hoc, I think it's a critical way of reaching stakeholders that you would not otherwise get. And whether it's on a substantive policy issue like trade policy, whether it's to affinity groups, ethnic, racial groups, I mean, those are all critically important. I know at the Department of Labor, we probably have 15 of them, and we rely on them extensively for our policy development.
You had a question? Microphone to the far end. Yep, and then.
Chris, I'm curious while he's going there, do people say yes when you ask them? And do they say yes from corporate and other walks of life to come help? Or do you find it's really hard to get people to be on those advisory
You know, I think these are, whether it's a White House agent, a White House committee, an agency, these are still considered prestigious things. Yeah. It's a great way, not obviously, there's many people who have their own self-interest of why they want to be there to advocate for their own, whether company, unions, perspective. But I think a lot of people, it's a way of doing a little public service.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I wonder if you could,
Just,
sorry, Philippe Burke with Apache Capital. I wonder if you could give us an idea of what happens behind closed doors in negotiations. And in particular, what I mean, I'm sure there's been a lot of things that have been thought about and that are done that perhaps some of us in the public don't know. And some examples might be, you know, a president telling a member of Congress, look, I'm going to help you get reelected. You know, a Democrat saying that to a Republican. I'm going to help you if you do this. Or simply someone say, oh, I forget which president said, it's amazing what you can get done if you don't care about who takes the credit. Yeah. Right? I mean, I don't know if that's even possible now, if that has any power, that argument. And then maybe, and you know how at a time of war, we all coalesce, right? We all want to work together, get a problem solved. Is it possible to create that sense of urgency again? I mean, and I'm grasping for straws here. I'm just wondering that there has to be other ways, because clearly we're not getting things done. And at the end of the day, people are not going to get reelected. There's clearly a sense of, you know, they're trying to throw out the bums, right? In this election.
I'll make a somewhat impolite comment. For those of you who haven't read it, there was an article in the last issue of The Atlantic, not one of your magazines, but nevertheless a good one, by Jonathan Rauch, that really is worth reading, because you said what goes on in negotiations that's behind closed doors. What we have done is reform our system to provide transparency. I don't see how you negotiate in a transparent environment. And we've gotten rid of earmarks. Well, in theory, earmarks are terrible things. In fact, you need to be able, a president or a congressional leader or Paul Ryan with his caucus needs to be able to say to people, I need your help. This is how Woodrow Wilson got done 4 remarkable initiatives in the first 2 years of his administration, and it's how President Johnson got stuff done, and it's how we got stuff done. So we have reformed the system in ways that make it far less difficult.
Make it harder to work. You know, that my political education in Washington was the 1986 tax bill, which people always point back to as like, how could we do this again? It was a great bipartisan exercise. We lowered tax rates, but we also got rid of tax breaks. And what they often forget was at the end of that process, there was something like $14 billion worth of very particular special tax breaks. Literally, you could sit in the gallery of Congress and watch Bob Packwood collecting these little slips of paper from people and stuffing them in his pocket. $14 billion spent on special tax breaks that you could not do today.
You know, when I hear these very, very good points, I'm reminded we're in Philadelphia. And I was staring at Independence Hall last night, that the Constitutional Convention took place behind closed doors. And had it not taken place behind closed doors, the Constitution never would have been hammered out. Those very difficult compromises. Even with the help of ministers, would not have gotten.
Chris, go ahead.
One of the fun things of being at the White House was being a fly on the wall at some of these meetings. So one of my favorite meetings that the president would do every year was with the National Governors Association. And so the president would typically get up, he'd give a statement in front of the press would leave. And when the president is there just having a meeting with 50 governors, and it ranges from Chris Christie, Nikki Haley, Bobby Jindal, people who on most issues, the overwhelming issues, disagree with him, there's a lot of similarities. Each of them have to make a budget. Each of them have to provide services to their people. There are a lot more similarities than you would normally find between Democrats and Republicans when they're chief executives of their own governments than you would necessarily find then if you were sitting down with a group of Republican members of Congress.
Yeah, the problem is governors, you correctly say, governors are in a very different position than members of Congress for the reasons you said.
Question in the back.
Hi, my name is Dwight Holton. I'm an alum of the Clinton first administration and also served as the United States Attorney for Oregon early in the Obama administration. Yeah. Secretary Rubin mentioned, hi Secretary Rubin.
I remember you from those days.
Yes, absolutely. Secretary Rubin mentioned the collapse of confidence in trade, and the Dean mentioned the collapse of trust. I think together these reflect a collapse of confidence in globalization more broadly. It's shot through the Bernie movement. It's shot through the Trump movement. I think the only way to address that is if we better share the benefits of globalization.
Yep.
So the question is there room for bipartisan consensus? Can President Clinton call Speaker Ryan and say, and hold a summit like you guys held in Little Rock in 1992 and say, how are we going to better share the benefits of this? Because if not, we're done.
And it would take into account tax, it would take into account trade, it would take into account training, some worker training.
To move more of
the
this
whole.
down.
Is that just a pipe dream today?
Look, but could I just, 2 comments if I may? I think you're absolutely on the right track, although today, unlike the 90s, the really big displacer of wages and jobs is not globalization, it's technology. Technological development by vast multiples is more important than globalization. Point 2, you are absolutely right. I personally think, I did this at the Aspen Ideas Festival, I laid out what I thought at least was a reasonable policy agenda. I'm sure a lot of people would disagree with a whole bunch of parts of it, to try to make the system work for everybody. And we're going to have new and novel and innovative thinking. We might need I personally think we're going to need public employment and so forth. But the trouble is, you asked the right question. If you did that and you go up to the Hill and you say, let's work on this together, what kind of response would you get? And I think we're all
Chris,
troubled about the probability of Congress.
Can you envision that? We're making some assumptions here, like we're assuming a Clinton presidency and we're assuming Paul Ryan stays as Speaker of the House. Can you envision that kind of a conversation happening productively, and would you bet your presidency on it?
I think the disconnect is, I think the American people don't understand when you go into a Walmart and you buy a $8 T-shirt or you buy a $200 TV, you're getting the benefits of globalization. And so they don't understand that has helped them in some ways. Yet every single one of them can point to someone who has lost their job to a factory that's closed. It may or may not have been because of trade. It may have been because of technology. And so it's the benefits of trade are much more diffuse. The downsides are much more obvious or perceived as much more obvious.
But that's why we have leaders. I mean, so the question is, do leaders have enough capital post-election? Would Paul Ryan and Hillary Clinton have enough capital post-election to come together and say, we hear you, we get it, this is the package we put together? What? Wrong question.
No, it's the right
Again.
question. No, it's the right question. I think your problem, Alan, is it seems like we may be heading toward a campaign of vast negativity, and I don't know how much capital you come out of a
There's
campaign
no capital
like that
when you
with.
come out of it.
And Hillary Clinton's walking back from her commitment to free trade.
Right.
which is-
Yes, and Tim Kaine as well, right here.
Kathleen Brown, Manette Phelps and Phillips, former treasurer of California.
Yep.
You touched on the infrastructure possibility as something bipartisan, picking up on the question that was just asked. And given the fact that whether it's Trump or Clinton, everyone is talking about how we need to create employment, how we need to make things, do things in America. Is infrastructure a vehicle that could bring different parties together?
Everybody's just sighing up here.
No, look, I speak on management and operations issues, not policy. But I think one of the aspects of infrastructure that is appealing from a management standpoint is it's everywhere. And it's in every community, and it matters in every community in some form or fashion. And so I think there is something when CEOs want to make a culture change, they try to find something that doesn't just matter to the top 100 people in the company. They try to find something that is going to drive performance all the way through. And I think the notion that Alan raises about infrastructure, one of the appeals from a management standpoint, if you will, or a leadership standpoint, is its broad appeal and its broad importance. And so to me, when we go for an issue, it probably does need to be something like that.
Kathleen, I agree with that, but I think there are two problems that are going to have to be solved, and they're very difficult. How do you pay for it? And that's going to create massive disagreements. And secondly, how do you allocate the dollars? Because they've tended to be allocated politically, and the returns on federal infrastructure are not very high as a consequence.
Austin, you've been lurking there in the back row. I don't know if you did that in
elementary.
Really, is that what he does?
Yeah, he tends to lurk.
Best video ever.
So I'm going to put
my hand. What do you?
Well, again, you've been through this more recently. Is infrastructure something that could bring the parties together in a constructive way?
I don't think so, just because there is one major component of the Republican Party that turned the word infrastructure into
pork.
That's pork, and that's big government spending. And look, it is true, if you look at the history, there have been some great successes on infrastructure. There are some glaring inadequacies on our economic infrastructure, but there have also been poorly governed highways getting built that serve very few people, and so I think there's some complexity with that. I think Bob's observation that technology has been much more important on the wage problems we have than globalization has is exactly right, and that's what makes me think that if you want to think of it as infrastructure, the investing in the skill base of our own people is really if there were one thing that we ought to be able to wrap our heads around together and say, look, we know we're going to have to do this, it would be that. But that hasn't been that big of an issue.
Was there another question? Yes, right here.
Thank you very much. I'm Eleni Kounalakis. I'm the former U.S. ambassador to Hungary. And in that capacity, we spent a lot of time, I was there in 2010 to 2013, talking about what made a strong, sustainable democracy and what made a strong constitution. And here in Philly, I'm a delegate for Hillary, and I was down on the floor last night, and I was really struck by Elizabeth Warren's comments, because what she said is a little bit different than what we're talking about here relative to gridlock. She's saying that Washington is actually getting a lot done for the 1%, for the 0.1%, and that for strong financial interests, bills are getting through. But when it comes to doing things that is in the interest of the people, things are not getting done. And I believe she ended it by pointing into the camera and saying, the people are coming for you. So what I ask all of you, if in this last few minutes of this very interesting conversation, is if you could draw back the lens a little bit and tell us how long is this sustainable for our democracy?
Until they come for us all.
Well, look, you do have a tremendous problem with respect to wage stagnation and with respect to income inequality, and I think the responses to that go back to the inclusive growth kind of agenda I was talking about before. I'm not sure what we've done specifically that's helped the top 1.1, whatever. I didn't hear her speech, so I don't know what it was.
Yeah, no, that was her.
Yeah, well,
she was saying
but I think
the oil companies can come and get their special deal.
Well, what have they gotten lately? I don't.
It
you
wasn't
want to know
specific.
what the list of specifics would be, and then you can make a judgment whether that's really happened or not.
It's kind of hard to, it goes back to the log rolling thing, it's kind of hard to get specific little things if no bills are moving. Final comments, Viv. Bring it all together.
Bring it all together. I think there's the what, and there is also the how. And I think one of the things we have not talked about that I would just like to put on the table, and I leaned over and said something to Bob, and he encouraged me to raise it, was if we take in the technology disruption and say that what we really need to do is what Austin said and invest in our people, I think the how is going to matter a lot, and maybe the how could create the bipartisan opportunity. Does it all have to be run through the federal government, or do we in fact work through state and local governments, which, while challenged, are not as challenged today in getting many things moving? And is there a way to think about encouraging the how as part of getting bipartisan support on board for what are very challenging times? And you know, good CEOs always say, you prepare for the crisis, you don't wait for it, and then take advantage of it. And I would love to see our government move off of, you know, taking advantage of the great crisis only, but in fact trying to be prepared and preventing the crisis before it happens.
Chris.
I will piggyback off that. While I am certainly pessimistic about the state of Washington, I'm incredibly optimistic about what's happening around the country in state and local governments. Really, they are the laboratories of innovation right now. On the issues that we focus on at the Department of Labor, whether it's the minimum wage, whether it's paid leave policies, they are trying to squarely address the wage stagnation issues. I also think about what's happening in the private sector, in part because of a tightening labor market. Companies are understanding the importance of investing in their workers, that investing in training and investing in workplace flexibilities allows you to better recruit people and retain people. So I'm optimistic that there is change happening. It's just not happening in Washington.
Sid?
You know, oh gosh, I don't know. These are all such interesting points. I'm sitting here and I'm skeptical about bipartisan solutions to the things that ail us, because if I look at history, which is a disease I have, I don't think most of the major developments in American democracy have happened through bipartisan agreements, which is not to demean some of the great bipartisan agreements that were made during the Clinton administration. They've come through a kind of breakthrough election where one party and its principles and its programs comes in after a very consequential election and puts this program in place. Now, you know, Franklin Roosevelt had some support from Republicans, but overwhelmingly it was the Democratic Party that enacted the New Deal, and it was overwhelmingly the Democratic Party that enacted the Great Society. The Reagan Revolution was a Republican.
None of those bills passed on as narrow a partisan basis as the health care bill.
So the fact that not one Republican voted for the Affordable Care Act, even after there were many compromises, like giving up the public option, may suggest we're in a new day, so that these kind of breakthrough elections where there's a consensus can be built from a party victory is no longer possible.
Bob, final words of wisdom.
If that's true, then our society is in a lot of trouble, Chris, because basically you can't do anything in the Senate without 60 votes except for reconciliation, which the ACA was. So a rare thing can be done if you can get a breakthrough election. I guess I'd have two comments. I think the ambassador raised a very important point. I don't think Elizabeth Warren's things will stand up if you look at the specifics, but her basic point is a democracy. I don't believe our democracies, the Eurozone, Japan, the United States, the great democratic economies, they're not working. And the question is, and they're not going to work unless they work for the predominance of our people. And I think that's the great challenge for the next President of the United States, to articulate that, to articulate a program. And it's not just the United States, unfortunately, it's the other two great democratic economies. And I have a very troubled view about the effectiveness of democracy in today's world, but I think that is the great challenge for the next, a great challenge is to articulate this in a way that hopefully people will resonate to.
Final word,
Bill? States can't be the answer because, states can do a lot, but the predominance of our revenues are at the federal level, and a lot of issues like immigration reform and much else are inherently federal.
Headline, Rubin denounces federalism.
Are you done?
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay, good. Bill.
Well,
now can you misreport it?
You said you were done.
Peace.
This was just a terrific discussion and a terrific panel. I want to start by thanking the audience. What an extraordinary audience we have. I mean, I just sort of went through the list. We have congressmen, ambassadors, state cabinet level officials, senior White House staff, future White House staff, and Pulitzer Prize winning authors in the audience here. And I'm blessed that many of them are friends. And blessed with this terrific panel. All were terrific. I will thank each of them privately, but I want all of us to thank all of them, and then also thank the staff that put this together. The Miller Center staff, who's now done this in 2 different convention cities in 2 weeks in the middle of what are probably family vacations for everybody, as well as the Sunnyland staff, who have been a terrific partner in this, and want to thank Kathleen and Jeff and others on the Sunnyland team who are here. So thank you all for a terrific conversation.